I want you to do me a favor.
Yeah, sure.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can. Pain with control.
Now, another thing is that need for really rough play. And a lot of my friends, they brag about how badly their kids hurt them. Oh my gosh, my daughter came at me the other day. I had no idea how strong she was. She pulled my arm out of the socket. And they're proud. They're proud that their kid can play that rough and is growing up that strong. You know, we've kind of fallen away from this idea of consensual rough play. And I think Fight Club resonated with that a lot.
Wait, what? This is crazy. You want me to hit you?
That's right.
What, like in the face?
Surprise me.
This is so fucking stupid. Motherfucker!
Fight Club is the most important film about the state of Western masculinity in recent memory. The 1999 classic painfully highlights the greatest disease of our civilization, namely the emasculation of the Western man.
We're still men.
Yes, we're men. Men is what we are.
Over the course of its narrative, the film offers the viewer a radical antidote to this disease. It presents the philosophical concept of the Nietzschean Übermensch. The nameless protagonist of Fight Club, simply described as the narrator, embodies a typical late 20th century American consumer. His life is dedicated solely to the acquisition of wealth, which he invests in the products of international mega corporations.
I'd flip through catalogs and wonder, what kind of dining set defines me as a person?
The anti-consumerist stance of Tyler Durden becomes obvious when he verbalizes his concern about a modern way of life. Shortly after the narrator meets Tyler, he discovers that his apartment went up in flames. After this unfortunate event, realizing that he has no friends to call, he calls Tyler. The two meet, and the narrator complains about losing his furniture and his respectable and almost complete wardrobe. Tyler responds rather indifferently and slightly sarcastically before he begins to express his views on the matter. I quote, "We're consumers. We are byproducts of a lifestyle obsession. Murder, crime, poverty, these things don't concern me. What concerns me are celebrity magazines, television with 500 channels, some guy's name on my underwear, Rogaine, Viagra, Olestra." End quote.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Way of thinking touches upon an ancient cynic philosopher named Diogenes of Sinope, who believed that modern civilized life hinders our natural state. At the end of the movie, it appears that the narrator has destroyed his apartment himself when he was taken over by his alter ego, Tyler Durden. This deed was the first step onto the road of detachment from his property into a more authentic way of life, and to, how Tyler puts it, reject the basic assumptions of civilization, especially the importance of material possessions. The narrator moves in with Tyler, who lives in a dilapidated house with ongoing leaks, power failures, and no IKEA furniture. Slowly but surely, the narrator indeed detaches from his previously destroyed property. Things you own end up owning you, Tyler tells him. And this simple piece of wisdom probably hits home when the narrator realizes that he doesn't need all these worldly goods and is actually much happier without them.
In the movie, Tyler Durden, the charismatic driving force behind the titular Fight Club, turns his decrepit house into a boot camp for homegrown terrorists. His action wouldn't be out of place in a re-education camp. He strips a group of men of their individuality so that they will do what their self-appointed dictator tells them to do.
You are not special. You are not a beautiful or unique snowflake.
But earlier in the film, Durden points out that modern society does the same thing, asking us to craft identities around consumer products and the jobs we need to afford them.
You're not your job. You're not how much money you have in the bank. You're not the car you drive. You're not the contents of your wallet. You're not your khakis.
Well, obviously there's the characters and their ideologies, primarily the narrator and Tyler Durden. Also, the actual things that happen in the plot. The narrator likes his nice life with nice things, and Tyler Durden doesn't, noting that
Things you own end up owning you.
Then there's the story structure. Like many antagonists, Durden's role is to put forth the radical ideas that disrupt the protagonist's way of thinking. This creates a central conflict that the protagonist has to reconcile by finding a happy medium between the villain's philosophy and the status quo. So in this case, we could say that Tyler Durden's critique of our consumer society is either true or mostly true.
Now, why do guys like you and I know what a tefé is? Is this essential to our survival in the hunter-gatherer sense of the word? No. What are we then?
Consumers.
It was nearly a century ago, 1922 to be precise, when the very famous English poet T.S. Eliot published his poem, The Wasteland. Some sense the landscape that followed World War I was in fact a wasteland, at least according to his interpretation. But you might be asking, why am I mentioning T.S. Eliot and World War I and the wasteland? Well, mention it because we also live in a wasteland. And it's eerily similar and yet eerily different at the same time. And I jump from T.S. Eliot, a famous, eloquent English poet, to a character in a book and film, none other than Tyler Durden, who could probably be viewed as a thug. And yet what he had to say, and this is something I've quoted a number of times in the past, seems so appropriate and so accurate concerning our own time and us, we who inhabit this epoch, the denizens of 2021, although he said it more than 2 decades earlier.
We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives.
Now, why do I mention that? Well, for the simple reason that it provides such a massive contrast to the poem The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, a poem that is quite literally, in most of its aspects, about the devastation of World War I and the effects it had on the landscape and human psychology. And then Tyler Durden comes around in the 1990s and says, well, we don't have a Great War. There's no massive economic depression, at least as yet, not at that time. And yet, why on earth are we the miserable wretches that we are? Now, the 1990s were actually a long time ago, all things considered. What would Tyler Durden say in 2021? He thought it was bad back then. Well, as they say, he ain't seen nothing yet. So what is this wasteland of 2021, the one we inhabit? Well, it's a bit complicated. But as usual, as is often the case, the United States is the epicenter of this, although the entire West has been affected, and arguably the entire globe. Because unlike World War I, there wasn't a great loss of life, destruction, leveling of civilization. And yet, we see apparitions of many of the things you could observe in the wake of a massive war. Depression, people taking their own lives, etc., etc. What has happened? Well, here's the fundamental problem. And I think it's related to a fundamental issue of how we, or rather the powers that be, view the world. For quite some time now, really accelerating in the 90s, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain, if you will, there's been a view, some people call it neoliberalism, that material goods and achieving material wealth is the greatest goal one can pursue and arrive at.
At one point, the narrator tells us,
when you have insomnia, you're never really asleep. And you're never really awake.
As he watches an infomercial, suggesting that he's not only half-conscious because of insomnia, but also consumerism. But more importantly, Fight Club shows a world of what sociologists call rationalization. Rationalization in this sense isn't quite using rationality in the way you might think, but using a certain kind of rationality to organize society. Essentially, rationalization favors efficiency over tradition, custom, or individual desires. So, for example, instead of getting your pies made with love from the nice little baker down the street, you get them from a factory where they're made on a cold, dead assembly line. Modern social life is pretty much dominated by rationalization. It's organized to accommodate large numbers of people in the most efficient way possible. Everything in the narrator's life is designed for a specific purpose, mass-produced and unrelentingly predictable, down to his boss's tie.
It must have been Tuesday. He was wearing his cornflower blue tie.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off.
That buying that house, that car, having the big screen TV back in the day, or alternatively having the best computer possible. These are all things that are supposed to enrich us. In some way they do. Material wealth does enrich us. But in all these calculations about GDP and material goods and wealth, there's always something missing. And it's something that is perhaps immeasurable. I don't like to use the word spiritual, because I don't even know what that means. But there are certain things you simply cannot measure. And we can observe this trend for decades, only in recent times being accelerated up to the wazoo, that people are less content than ever. And so the devastation, the wasteland we live in, is in some ways far worse than the wasteland in the post-World War I landscape of T.S. Eliot. Because despite World War II, something they didn't know about at the time, there was a sense that things indeed could be rebuilt. But what can be rebuilt within the technocracy that we live in?
And also the idea that there needs to be a secondary father in men's lives. You're born, if you're lucky, with a biological father that you do not choose, and that is the nurturing, loving father that you eventually kind of have to reject. But in doing so, you have to choose a new father. That father by choice typically is a minister or a teacher or a drill sergeant or a coach, one of those fathers. And you kind of put yourself in apprenticeship to the secondary father.
Too young. Sorry. If the applicant is young, tell him he's too young. Old, too old, fat, too fat. If the applicant then waits for 3 days without food, shelter, or encouragement, he may then enter and begin his training.
And you have to sort of consign your life to the secondary father and agree to learn what they're going to teach you, just like in Karate Kid. And that is getting harder and harder and harder to find.
Think this is a game? You're too young to train here. End of story. Now quit wasting our time. Get the fuck out of here. Get off the porch!
Sooner or later, we all became what Tyler wanted us to be.
I'm gonna go inside and I'm gonna get a shovel.
So Fight Club was also depicting a new form of the secondary father with all these kids that were showing up on the doorstep of this ramshackle old house.
Got 2 black shirts?
Sir.
2 pair of black pants?
Yes, sir.
1 pair of black boots?
Sir.
2 pair of black socks?
Sir.
1 black jacket?
Sir.
$300 personal burial money?
Yes, sir.
All right. You're too old, fat man. Your tits are too big. Get the fuck off my porch.
You are apprenticing yourself to somebody that you're going to do all this grunt work for, but in exchange, you're going to learn a kind of really master skill at something.
Okay, so last one we're going to get into is Joseph Campbell's idea of the second father figure and apprenticeship. And this was basically like, none of our lives, we're all going to die at one point, right? So Joseph Campbell saw it as like, if you really like just sacrifice your childhood at one point, we all have to, right? And you dedicated yourself to learning something from an apprentice, you would die for something and not for nothing, okay? This is like a blacksmith back in the day. So now you see in Fight Club, you got all of these kids and they're showing up to the Paper Street mansion, right? And what are they looking for? They're looking for responsibility. They want to take that initiation step and become like a man. And who's going to teach them? The secondary father figure is Tyler to all these kids. He's going to take them into Project Mayhem. He's going to teach them how to do stuff and, you know, become a man and go out into the world. Not the best way, they're blowing stuff up, but, you know, that's what they're doing.
Tyler's strategy to guide his other half towards enlightenment is preaching a contemporary interpretation of Nietzschean philosophy. The film itself functions as an allegory for the philosopher's 19th century magnum opus, the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The central story here revolves around the character Zarathustra, who preaches to the great unwashed masses that God is dead and therefore man has to evolve or be annihilated. In it, Nietzsche also offers a harsh critique of Western Christianity. According to him, its most emphasized value was humanity's search for truth, which it offered in form of its own dogma. This caused civilization to perpetually seek truth, which culminated in the discovery of the scientific method and the emergence of the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. This in turn resulted in the decline of Christianity in the West. The implication of this was a dark one, however, because the refutation of this highest of all beliefs created cynicism towards all other supposed meta-truths and values.